We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Harry, find your hair to be president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothgusho.
All right, that's the first time we've said that, been able to say that for a bit here, as we are back here in 2024. A lot has happened, and I think we both needed to take a little bit of a reset, Jeremy, but we are back and ready to get into what I'm going to call here looking forward by going backward, I guess. Looking back at the last couple of months and some of the things that have happened as a means of looking forward to what might be the most fateful year in terms of like modern, American politics, and in terms of our modern American political landscape, perhaps up there with a few exceptions. But I mean, this is definitely, as I say a lot, uncharted waters we're heading into. So we were able to reset a little bit at the end of 2023, which I think was necessary for both of us. And now we're ready to really try to just navigate the landscape of 2024 as best we can with the type of commentary and analysis that we provide here.
Yeah, and hopefully we will be moving forward while looking backwards, or looking forward by looking backward rather than looking forward while moving backward. But we cannot forget what has immediately happened, what is ongoing right now, and then as we think is important here to do, to even dig a little bit deeper into history around some of these crucial arcs of history or deep events that really help us understand our current moment more deeply. And so 2024 is, we're well into it now at this point. And it will definitely be shaping up as maybe one of the more consequential political years, at the very least domestically in the United States. I get the sense of a national political climate like we will have never seen before, in terms of the potential decomposition of bipartisan politics to some extent. So, yeah.
And in terms of looking forward and backwards, both, you can look at this through both the lens of short-term and long-term modern history. In the short term, our domestic landscape is directly affected by the events of October 7th. Of course, with the attacks in Israel and everything that's happened since then, with the a lot of the conversations and discourse around the very, very heightened, weaponized culture wars really being turned up, with an emphasis on issues as it relates to issues surrounding Israel and Palestine, and the issue of the Palestinians, and the issue of what is and is not anti-Semitism, all the things we were talking about just before 10/7 with the whole Ban the ADL campaign, and still a lot of those factors are at play. But our immediate landscape, culturally, socially, even politically, has been shaped and affected by, or in part by, the events of 10/7, as well as what we talk about with the more long-term lens of, you see this latest iteration of Donald Trump continued dominance, among other things, and it's so many roads, if not all, lead back to the respective events of what we titled our series as back in 2018, from 9/11 to 11/9. Those two events continue to be so front and center. And as you talked about going into the uncharted waters, Sarah Kendzior continues to remind people of this, that this is post-coup attempt America, and that, we've got a person who actually this is unprecedented almost, and that a person's being allowed to run for office again, that was at the forefront of, and I know some people don't like to hear this, but at the forefront of really trying to stay in power and usurp the rule of law and the transition of government and transition of power and all this. I mean, so it's very uncharted. And then also, as I think I talked a little bit about this, and we were starting to talk about it among ourselves before we, kind of took a break to reset and reprocess. But the opposition party, quote unquote, 10/7 was a really bad time in terms of exposing and of like a very one of the major weak points, which of course is the question around Israel and the inability of so many people to stand up and just to not not rock the apple cart, so to speak, with the serious levers of power that come from the domestic lobby and other interests. And so it's just been playing out all over, going back to 10/7, all over our political landscape, from battles on college campuses and the shaping of speech and what is and is not considered acceptable on our college campuses, all the way to just a major look, puts a direct lens and microscope on some of the more problematic states of our current domestic politics, even, as we talked about a lot, like the people who are supposed to be seen as and are a big part of the reason why someone like a Trump and everything that came with it was able to come to prominence in the first place, because of the problems within our own domestic political system. And a big part of that is this relationship with the obviously the domestic Israel lobby, where the sitting president, who's seen as who was seen in the Obama years, and I think in some ways there's evidence to point in this direction, was seen as a problem for elements of the Netanyahu government in Joe Biden, just being, I would say feckless would be an understatement in terms of like just the green lighting of mass slaughter of civilians and children going on, and all the problems that come with that. And so it shapes us in so many ways, and this is just one of them. And it's shaping both the discourse around like the immediate direct danger we face, like with the prospects of Trump and everything that comes with it once again, but then also like dealing with the problems and weaknesses of one thing, last thing I'll say is the idea that people have that like that there's some people out there who should probably know better, who think that people should just turn a blind eye to like Democrats, and even up to the office of the presidency, just turning a blind eye to what's going on since 10/7, and then just thinking that people are just supposed to shrug their shoulders and just uncritically support that, and because Trump is really bad, and like that's not the way to go about addressing the Trump problem, I would say, to say the least.
No, and the fact that we can't even talk about such events that have dates, for example, such as you brought up January 6th in the questions around what was the relationship of January 6th to questions very core to the law in the United States, in terms of where does free speech and core political activity end, and where does sedition and conspiracy against the people of the United States or the government of the United States begin. And that this is still quote unquote controversial in terms of what January 6th was, who did it, and why, the nature of an inside job in relationship to that. I mean, this is very similar in many ways to the quote unquote controversy around September 11th. Even if you were to talk about the quote unquote alternative analysis of 9/11 and the quote unquote inside job aspect of 9/11, where it is obvious that it wasn't the U.S. Post Office that organized it, and that you have to deal with a deeper and maybe a more commanding heights kind of analysis of cells, of actual terrorist cells, in terms of these kinds of deep events. That this all shows that forensics and facts and real serious historical analysis still really matters immediately, every single day, in terms of even just its effect on mass consciousness, public punditry. And a few years ago, I pointed out that there was that psychological warfare in an institutional fashion that emerges out of the bowels of the Israeli so-called security state, that they actually have an organization called Consciousness Operations, Con Ops, as I shortened it. And that is meant to be a play also, obviously, on, not only consciousness operations, but also a con. We talk about long wars. What about long cons? And so I think that this begins to point out that we continue to have to really wrestle with the nature of forensics about specific events, how they lead to what's very overt in terms of the ongoing mass violence, destruction, attempted national genocide that is ongoing by the Israeli state in Gaza against the Palestinian people. Some of that, people will debate about the numbers, how many thousands of children have been killed by the Israelis, but thousands of children have been killed by the Israelis. That is a non-controversial statement. And a lot of that then hooks back into the question of what was October 7th. And so casting back the fact that we have this series of controversial events that are obviously the hinge points of ongoing history, I think points to the ongoing problem of the avoidance of truth and how you get to the truth and the hard problems of forensics in terms of some of these kinds of events. And right, so that goes back through 10/7 to 1/6 to 11/9, as we call it, to 9/11, onwards and backwards to the 90s and the domestic terrorism in the United States in the 90s, on back, obviously, to the litany of assassinations in the 60s, the 11/22 assassination of an American president. And these networks of power continue to be front and center. I would say, that one of the key pieces of controversy, let's say around the assassination of the Kennedy brothers in the 60s, is fully on display right now in terms of the networks of power that I believe actually drove the macro circumstances of the October 7th operation, and then obviously the quote unquote ongoing genocidal response to it. And it shows up in our domestic politics in terms of this crucial independent now candidate for president, RFK Jr. And so I just more and more believe that we need to figure out how to match our meta-analysis, or maybe our counterintelligence analysis of the way that narrative warfare works, that political, psychological dynamics work at mass scale, to intelligence in many ways. And then that then includes assessing the work of military grade, at the very least, operations that have to do with how do you actually make a January 6th go from a protest to a storming of the Capitol, with, at the very least, some involved with seditious intent and conspiracy to commit some type of insurrectionary act, and then onwards and backwards through these other deep events that I've brought up here. And of course, in our time away from the antidote, things like the anniversary of the assassination of Kennedy happened, the death of Kissinger happened. Now, some of this actually, actually on the date on November 22nd of 2023, I actually did a Twitter space, an X space, with this quote unquote ex-CIA guy, Brian Cunningham, who had worked inside of the 9/11 Commission, had been a deputy of sorts, a national security deputy of sorts for Condoleezza Rice during the George W. Bush administration. And the point that he had made for the space was to deal with all these 9/11 conspiracy theories that were now popping up in the wake of October 7th that spoke about especially the question of Israel and 9/11, with some concern around the CIA and 9/11 too. But then very quickly, it became unavoidable, and Cunningham brought this up himself about the Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories. And so then I had to go right there, and that ultimately consumed a bunch of the time in terms of that. So that's just an example of the way that these interlocking intergenerational controversies continue to play directly into the moment, and so I'm still very interested in terms of excavating some of the forensics around what October 7th was in terms of the relationship of Hamas and the Netanyahu regime, and what actually happened, and the ongoing bringing out of more and more information that really confirmed what I had originally thought, and really directed people to focus on this question of the Hannibal directive. And now it's come out that there was what has been termed sort of semi-officially by certain Israeli military folks as mass Hannibal directive that was immediately deployed in the hours of October 7th, 2023, meaning uh, basically a total warfare response to the attack, which then looked like assault helicopters basically taking out entire sets of vehicles with potentially escaping Israelis, and blowing up entire buildings in some of these kibbutzes. And so the specific forensics of how many Israeli victims on October 7th were killed by the Israeli military versus by Hamas and other Palestinian Gaza militants will continue to be excavated. But similarly to the question of how many Palestinian children continue to be killed by the Israeli military in Gaza, it is an uncontroversial statement of fact that many Israelis were killed by the Israeli military on October 7th. Now, there will be a continuing controversy now, and I've already seen a lot of the blowback from many different kinds of analytical and journalistic circles in terms of this analysis of Israel's 9/11. As it was immediately proclaimed and pushed, not only as an analysis, but as a narrative. And the justification of Israel's quote unquote response by talking about how many 9/11s comparatively of Israeli civilians were killed on October 7th compared to the American 9/11. And now you and I immediately saw the underlying narrative warfare behind the invocation of 9/11 as the archetype for this event, especially with this Netanyahu character sitting there. And now the parallels are not perfect, nor should they be. I think that would, if the parallels were seen to be perfect, then I think that would indicate an analytical monoculture of some sort. But I continue to believe, and I believe the analysis becomes stronger over time, that what we had put forth as our analysis just 2 weeks after October 7th in October on the AnteDote continues to be, I think, to play out as very likely what October 7th was. A let it happen kind of situation in the short term, a stand down of security. More and more evidence has come out from what is largely a group of female Israeli border guards who are responsible for the basic reconnaissance, intelligence, and reporting what's happening at the border, including questions, I believe, that hook into things like reconnaissance, satellite reconnaissance, Unit 9900 in Israel, and that these border guards were basically shut down, that they were warning of all of these layers of something coming from across the border in Gaza for many months, maybe up to and maybe over a year. And what's interesting, I was in another X space, this time with Ryan Dawson, where he was demeaning basically that it was all these it was basically Dawson was making a parallel sort of, anti-woke DEI kind of argument about how all these female Israeli border guards failed or something like that. And I pointed out at the time, and this analysis has only gotten stronger via the actual direct facts from the border guards themselves, that no, it was actually potentially the opposite. They were doing their job as their job had been prescribed. They were noticing all these things. They were reporting all these things, and they were being stood down. And I also push back against Ryan in terms of this interview that he had done with Scott Ritter, with some unnamed source, intelligence sources from inside Israel, had said that this was because AI has taken over Israeli security and there are no humans in the mix, and the AI was just doing analysis that didn't include humans, and this basically was a David versus Goliath, with the Hamas militants being the David with the stone and the slingshot, and the Israeli AI technocratic elite answering only to AI were the Goliath who'd been brought down. Now, all of this just exactly reminds me of the post 9/11 period, where we even have like the Ward Churchill types who were in the wake of 9/11 calling, different people who worked in the World Trade Centers little Eichmanns, and that this was just a global slave revolt out of Southern Asia that this massive American cyclops missed, and all of that. And we've seen this, even like the Norman Finkelsteins. This was like sort of the Norman Finkelstein line immediately after October 7th, a successful slave uprising. But it's not just them, and this might be my final point, Greg, before I pass it back to you, but it's also the people who are have this sort of, I think, a fantasy of an axis of resistance that includes Hamas and the Houthis and Iran and Russia, that this is an authentic resistance to the global Zio-American pig empire of some sort. And so they see this kind of analysis also as basically just running cover for the Israelis by projecting the Israelis as all-knowing and all-powerful of some sort. And so I find these kinds of narrative horseshoes very, very interesting.
Yeah, they're like little Bagans. Would that be the equivalent to little Eichmanns?
Yes, yeah, the little little Bagans or little Shamirs, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And it's interesting. And I want to circle back to this in a second, but I want to come back. But I wanted to circle back to you mentioning Robert Kennedy Jr. And it's very interesting on the. Of course, it was the 60th anniversary of his uncle's assassination on November 22nd, and now just this week was Martin Luther King Day, and Robert Kennedy Jr. Made a big deal about defending the decision of his father and his uncle to wiretap and surveil Martin Luther King. Basically, I think it was under like he had to do it because, the FBI saw him as a threat and all this. But even that is interesting with hindsight, then I'm thinking about that because you combine that with somebody who I've been keeping an eye on recently in terms of a very noticeable shift in a very noticeable shift in direction in terms of the tone of discourse over the last couple of years, and that's Charlie Kirk. And Charlie Kirk was railing against the idea of Martin Luther King being seen as some type of good historical figure, and really treading into the waters of like what you'd find at places like Stormfront and VDARE over the last couple of decades, with the whole idea of, this man was a dangerous communist who was, a dangerous communist and womanizer who wanted to, who they made a hero out of for pushing like the whole idea of MLK was the harbinger and the bringer on of the Marxist revolution in America and all this. So I found that very interesting. That's kind of interesting thought I had from Robert Kennedy Jr., justifying from a attempting to justify from a historical perspective, or at least rationalize the surveillance of King by President Robert Kennedy, or President John Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, combined with Charlie Kirk going in this very, I'd say, pretty dark direction in terms of his discourse and rhetoric in a lot of ways, which is now I call him he's like the Jared Taylor to Nick Fuentes' David Duke at this point. Charlie Kirk won't say the J word, and Jared Taylor and David. So there's a parallel there, and I wanted to bring that in because I think that's a very interesting development that I noticed this past week. And then circling back to the question of Israel and the events of 10/7, the aftermath, I caught on to, there was a debate, quote unquote debate interview with Piers Morgan on his UK platform with Norman Finkelstein. And, they argued about the whole thing with, Israel. And, of course, there were disagreements about quote unquote, who right and wrong and all of this. But it noticed that Finkelstein's immediate beginning was basically to rationalize and rationalize why this happened and the oppressed rising up against the oppressors. And that's what you were pointing out with this whole thing with Scott Ritter and Ryan Dawson and the failure of DEI wokeness and AI allowed Goliath to come up and hit and punch David in the nose, and David can't, and Goliath doesn't like being punched, and so it responds like a bully and all of this, and the parallels between the blowback narratives, and it's interesting even from a domestic perspective, all the way from this very, very Russian friendly, multipolar friendly, anti-imperialist foreign policy type of perspective, all the way to what is seen as being more elements that these types see as hostile, like Democracy Now! Types, are all very much pushing this was imperial blowback. And one thing that I noticed, and we didn't get a chance to talk about this on a show, I think we might have talked about this in a private conversation with our patrons that we host every now and a few weeks, but the topic of that there were stories that came out about Hamas, sexual assaults on Israeli women, and people like Max Blumenthal in the Gray Zone were very quickly to dismiss this as just it's imperial propaganda. It's like the type of people that would tell you that Gaddafi gave his soldiers Viagra, which, interestingly enough, I believe Max's father Sidney played a role in pushing that talking point. But I digress. But the idea then that the lionization and hero to make this heroic narrative around Hamas, when the evidence does point to Hamas being originally a cutout of Israeli until going back to the 80s, when I believe it was the Likud government of Shamir that was in power, and then more recently, at the very least, being seen by Netanyahu as something that could be taken advantage of or used for it, and then the relationship with Russia and the Hamas leadership in Russia on multiple occasions. And when you take into consideration all of these dynamics and factors, I think it's very likely, that it's not far-fetched. As a matter of fact, it's quite plausible that there would be certain heinous actions that would take place, perhaps to then justify or then be used as like the rationalization or justification for going in and committing even worse acts of slaughter than would be committed otherwise. So so I guess my point is this blowback narrative is even more dangerous in terms of like not only is it just like ignoring deep politics, but then also it makes heroes or lionizes as heroes and creates like this hero worship to some level or another around an entity that really, I think the evidence points to should not be looked at that, but very likely as an extension of the same forces that are carrying out this brutal callousness in Gaza right now as a result of the events of 10/7.
Yes, I want to respond with 3 points. One, first of all, in terms of the way that narrative warfare, I think, works, in terms of what you pointed out about I would call it the Ritter reversal. And what's interesting too, since this time, it looks like Scott Ritter has gone fully like becoming like a Russian military leader. I think he went to Chechnya in front of like thousands of ranks of Russian Chechen soldiers and gave them like an inspirational military speech. Now, okay, analysts and journalists can have all kinds of different takes on geopolitics and support different sides and different wars and conflicts. But giving a direct speech as a constitutionally oath-sworn American soldier to a foreign army, that seems to be jumping the shark to some extent, that now I believe proves out a lot of what we had been pointing out for years now in terms of the questions of Ritter and his background. And now there is some interesting complexity in terms of his relationship with Israel and potential compromise around Israel. But I think the question of Russia and compromise and questions of loyalty in terms of Ritter's deep relationship with Russia, I believe, are being totally proven out in the public realm at this point. Now, we may want to, in the coming weeks to months, may want to use Ritter's apparent sort of like rounding around the curve in terms of his now publicly stated denouncing of Israel as a state in general. And we might want to do some work to understand the larger geopolitical narrative warfare that might have something to do in terms of especially the very difficult, I think, Russian negotiation in public around their allegiances in terms of Israel, Palestine, and specifically the Netanyahu regime and Hamas engagement at this point. But this reversal, this AI reversal that Ritter did with Dawson, where before this is right, sort of maybe in weeks to maybe a month before it began to come out that the Israeli military really was using sort of AI-based targeting. I would say it's a combination of AI-based targeting with things like fusion center intelligence, things like Palantir. By the way, Palantir now just went directly to Israel to interface with the Israelis in terms of the use of their technology. That it came out that the Israelis were using these kinds of data analytics AI systems that were also being used by the U.S. military in terms of their what Mike Flynn might call counterinsurgency, or General Stanley McChrystal, both involved in the counterinsurgency, quote unquote, methods of the U.S. military, maybe especially in Afghanistan, but also Iraq. And even as we begin to know that there was drone strike targeting especially with a rise of that under the Obama administration, but then apparently an escalation of that under the quote unquote peace president of Donald Trump. Didn't start any new wars, as all his sort of cultists at all scales will try to falsely remind us of, especially into the African sphere, that they would use this cell phone targeting, data triangulation in terms of the basis for what was meant to be a lawful drone strike. And this is the basis, really, of the escalating amounts of very obviously non-hostiles and family members and wedding parties and all of these kinds of criminal strikes by the U.S. government during the escalation of the quote unquote war on terror. That is now, and many, it's very possible that this actually emerged out of the Israelis. Now, we know this to be the case in terms of post 9/11 torture policy. This was on the ground. There was Israeli supervisors and contractors that were working via the American private military contractors in terms of what, became things like the Abu Ghraib torture scandal. All right. We know that there was the so-called intellectual background of the Israeli so-called understanding of the Arab mind, that it only understands violence, humiliation, and you begin to see the background of things like both torture and sexual humiliation as emerging from some of these areas of militarized, weaponized Israeli psychology, so-called intellectuals, that then we then had that emerge in the American sphere post 9/11 in terms of the American, I think it was the Psychological Association scandal, where they were said they had contractors who were overseeing the post 9/11 torture. So it is very possible that this whole, and this makes sense to me, I've always thought this, the analysis points in that direction. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it was the Fusion Center in Kansas City guys who were the ones who then targeted me and us for direct action and assault and arrest and prosecution in terms of free speech around the Dennis Ross event in 2016 at the Kansas City Public Library. That these fusion centers emerged post 9/11. They came out of the Homeland Security apparatus that seemed to have been imported in many ways, very likely with a very strong Israeli, at the very least, interest, if not input. We know that this came hand in hand with the escalation of what's called the deadly exchange in terms of American police, especially command level operatives going to Israel to be quote unquote trained in counterterrorism. And really, I believe the psychology of occupation, the tactics of maintaining an occupation, and then that psychology and some of the tactics, including these intelligence fusion center tactics, brought back into the United States. So once again, not a coincidence, I think, that the two guys who were involved in grabbing and assaulting me while I was at a public event, invited to come speak at the microphone, they had both been to Israel within the last half year, paid by the local Jewish power institutions, basically via the Jewish Federation. Then the event sponsored by the Jewish Community Foundation. This is all the architecture of the Israel lobby, and then the way that Jewish power is institutionalized throughout not only the United States, but all of North America, and actually throughout the world in many ways. You'll see these different configurations of these kinds of groups and institutions that have names like Jewish as the first word, Jewish federations, that really, no matter the nature of their liberal or conservative local politics, they are the enforcers of the Israel lobby's desires and Jewish power more broadly in the United States. So I think that there was a major inversion that Ritter was at work on with his conversation of Dawson about how it was AI that had caused the Israeli Goliath to miss the slave uprising by the Hamas Davids, whereas it was really very likely the case that this was anticipating that the Israelis were actually using AI and Palantir and Fusion type counterinsurgency type metadata analytics to target entire families in Gaza for bombings. And now in this case, that was not actually, I don't believe, intended collateral damage. That's actually the point here. This is the Israelis are using this situation to do what they've always done, which is to target families, target individuals who potentially either have some kind of political legitimacy in terms of their rights to specific aspects of property or land that is now in what's considered Israel proper, or groups, families, and individuals who potentially represent a political threat. And and this is, of course, some of the deeper background of the Israeli sponsorship of Hamas and their the way that they used it as a religious counter gang to the sort of secular, maybe more sort of seen as global Marxist resistance, the PLO, who were very secular. And that part of this was to set up a situation where they would preserve themselves from actually having to speak with the organic Palestinian leadership, the intellectual Palestinian leadership, the activist Palestinian leadership. And now they've always targeted these folks, whether in the West Bank or in Gaza, in different ways. And they have either done the civil assassination, which was put forth by the then head of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, where she talked specifically about civil assassination around the world of anyone who was prominent and articulated why Israel should be subject to boycott, divestment, or sanctions. Or just direct physical violence or arrest or compromise in some cases in terms of using their intelligence services to get information about people that could be then used to compromise them and get them to shut up or do the Israeli wish. So that's one thing. I think that was a deep inversion, and to me it just sounds like totally made up. And I'm pretty sure Ritter didn't actually have any present sources in Israel to make the statement that this was the fault of AI missing this whole scenario, and that's how October 7th happened. Okay, then on to a question of the left and Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. I've noticed that in terms of Palestinian solidarity, that from the sort of sanctioned Palestinian groups to the Jewish Voices for Peace types, and which would then include in the middle some of the maybe more progressive American religious types and secular types, Christians, that the holiday was set off by an announcement of this big event in Chicago for Palestinian solidarity calling for ceasefire, with the headliner being Jesse Jackson. All right. And so we begin to run into this whole thing that you pointed out about Charlie Kirk is now, and even Nick Fuentes, I think, is basically making fun of Charlie Kirk about how Charlie Kirk, welcome to 2017, You might, you sort of are late to the let's call into question Martin Luther King
It's
Jr.'s legacy
interesting
part.
because what goes unspoken here, and sometimes Charlie Kirk will use it when it's advantageous to him, like, oh, finally Charlie Kirk's being red pilled or whatever. But is that this was the inevitable result once Charlie Kirk started going in this more weaponized Christian nationalist direction, is that this was the inevitable result that he would turn out basically to be a Nick Fuentes, whereas a few years ago, there was still some. But over the last couple of years, he's really taken this direction. And I think ultimately, if you look at it logically, like the logical result of moving in like this more overtly weaponized Christian nationalist direction, like this was the inevitable result, is that the rhetoric would, it's always been sort of similar, but like they would basically almost turn into carbon copies of each other, just with like, I made the comparison earlier, Kirk playing the role of Jared Taylor to Nick Fuentes as David Duke, but it seems pretty inevitable. But that is something that is like not really spoken as the right-wing movement in America continues to become more and more like just entirely like just taken over by like the forces of MAGA and all this. It is inevitable, but that doesn't really get talked about as much as it should, I don't think.
Yeah, and this, in many ways, this reminds me of our own experiences in 2017 in terms of when we began to really deeply explore the question of the assassinations of the 60s, including the King assassination. We did it in parallel or in a dynamic intellectual relationship with the deeper history of Jewish power and the rise of Zionism in the United States, especially via certain organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League, its parent organization, the B'nai B'rith. And it was very interesting that even at that time, we were both being attempted to be sort of like, almost like maybe recruited in a certain way to the network, the information networks that surrounded things like E. Michael Jones' Culture Wars and podcasts that would be, surrounding that kind of stance on things that I think that it's fair to say that people like Nick Fuentes and Charlie Kirk represent the modern right horseshoe, the contemporary right horseshoe of the weaponized culture war as an approach, or as I would say, an avoidance and a destabilization of real deep politics in many ways. And so we were either being recruited and at the same time being attacked in certain ways about not calling into question this commie bastard king who had, copied his thesis and plagiarism. And so it's interesting that at the same time, where now plagiarism is coming back into the fold in terms of like Black academics and the head of Harvard standing down in relationship to questions of allowing a rampant anti-Semitism, with the functionary, the shock troop being Chris Rufo, using culture war dynamics and accusations. It looks to me like false accusations potentially of plagiarism in terms of Gay. I think her name's Gay. His thesis.
Claudine
Gay's thesis and all of that. And yet the real, then I would say once again, the Israel lobby, the Jewish power dynamics are the ones who actually come in and operationalize the attack on the first a Black woman head of Harvard via networks like Bill Ackman, whose wife was involved with the philanthropic arm of the Epstein network via the MIT Media Lab, right? And we know there's the whole Epstein Harvard situation, and so that's a whole thing going on. And then just to finish the thought in terms of the problems with the left right now, in terms of what I noticed, that obviously that putting Jesse Jackson in Chicago as the big gathering, the intellectual political gathering to gather support for Palestinian solidarity and call for a ceasefire right around the time of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday shows the massive, dupiness of that entire set at the very best, and weaponization, really. Because I'll just, plainly state, it came out in the civil legal investigations of the King family via their lawyer, William Pepper, with thousands and thousands and thousands of hours and pages of evidence and documentation and interviews under oath, depositions, and all of that. Yeah, King was involved with the compromised FBI and military intelligence group that then interfaced via the Dixie mob with the local police, the dirtied up police elements in Memphis to set King up for assassination. And this is running parallel. I would point out two main things, obviously. You have the so-called Anti-Defamation League being a key infiltrator of King and his circles in terms of doing surveillance. And now this came out maybe almost a quarter century to 30 years later in the San Francisco Weekly by an ADL whistleblower himself, who had been working at the ADL during these early 60s years when the ADL was being instrumentalized as a spy on King and his network. And it continues to look like the case that there were some of the interests that the ADL had maybe beyond the FBI. And now that's the other point. We'll deal with that next. Hoover and, did RFK Jr. bring up the Shine family or the Crown, aka Krinsky family, in terms of King and the assassination of his father and the properties and the compromise of the head of the FBI, Hoover, directly via Shine family property down in Florida with Hoover's closeted deputy lover, Tolson, and all of that? No, he did not, of course. But one of the main things that the ADL was very likely interested in a similar way that they were interested in 30 years later when they were spying on virtually all of, at the very least, liberal to progressive, and not just. There was also targeting of certain conservative elements to spy on them on behalf of Israeli intelligence, hooked up with apartheid South African intelligence. That were the main things, obviously, that the ADL was concerned about was the question of Palestine, Israel and Palestine. And this continues to be another controversy. MLK Jr.'s relationship to Zionism, to Israel, to Palestine, and the part that continues to be covered up, I think, pretty intently, is the question of Arab/Palestinian solidarity in relationship to some of King's closest friends' networks, and then where he was intending to move in the years subsequent.
Yeah, and I think that this is a big part of historically the long term of what has now become in recent years what we've identified, this fear of America domestically. I think European society has been ahead of America in this regard, but in terms of American society becoming more, multicultural and much less inclined to just accept what is defined as just traditional American value, American conservatism combined with this infusion of Christian Zionism and all this. And as a result for that, support for Israel, support for the historic oppressor, because America has its own issues dealing with its own historical sins, for example, becomes more prevalent, and support for the Palestinian cause becomes more prevalent. There's been a significant fear of this, which I think has played a role in terms of geopolitical shifts and some of the upheaval and the changes, and in terms of some of the dynamics that have taken place in our politics over the last couple of decades is in part a big part of that is this fear of societal changes, which includes a change in the direction of people's attitudes towards things like Israel, Palestine, or it becoming more seeped into people's consciousness. And I think this long-term monitoring of like organized left politics by ADL type of organizations has historically been important in terms of like leading to this current moment of the last decade or so of this increased fear of like what a more multicultural, less inclined to believe like traditional, the idea of the conventional wisdom in a lot of circles of what like what America is combined with its outlook on the world is a major threat to these interests. And this is just the long term playing out of that now, really becoming very visibly, publicly playing out, like with all this battle over, DEI initiatives and wokeness and bad, evil, Black anti-Semitic college administrators and female college administrators. So this is the long term, I think, long-term playing of that leading into a moment like where we're at now.
Yes, and the too long didn't read aspect of King that the King family and their lawyer Pepper found out via years of litigation, and then Pepper writing 3 books about it, was that it was a high-level conspiracy to assassinate King via a certain unit set up inside of military U.S. military intelligence. A lot of it apparently handled via the Hoover Compromise FBI, and then the Dixie mob connected local networks surrounding the Memphis police. Now, the ADL piece is actually almost like appears like an umbrella over a lot of this in terms of similar kinds of connections to the New Orleans ADL that we see with certain elements of the John Kennedy assassination and questions of Raoul and Canada and what looks like geographically like a Bronfman ADL mega type network going on here. And Jackson was a paid informant. He was a paid snitch at the very least, and it looks like he helped set up King. And I'll just point out, like talked to publicly on camera, confronted dozens, if not more than 100 different kinds of public figures. But I would say that the time I felt the most intense potential, like physical threat and pushback was not the times that I was actually arrested, once at the Bill Maher show by the LAPD and once at the Kansas City Public Library by the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. Although, there was threat there, and actually there was more physical assault in both of those cases. In the Maher case, by the private security, basically bashed me, threw me against the concrete, broke my glasses, all of that. And in the Kansas City case, not massive physical assault, but like grabbing and pushing and all of that, and then ultimately arrest and prosecution there. But the time that I felt the most direct physical pushback and threat as an aura and in a sort of mob kind of situation was when I confronted Jesse Jackson when he came to Occupy LA in the fall of 2011. And I asked him this question. I said, there are these people, there are researchers in the African American community, including people like Steve Coakley, who have identified you as being on the inside of the operation to kill King. And there was massive pushing, and people were grabbing me, and the guy who had helped bring him to Occupy LA who, by the way, had identified himself as former American military intelligence, by the way. He was really trying to, in the midst of it, when Jackson was giving his speech, I was interjecting with certain points. He was really trying to get me to be quiet. And then after the fact, there was a lot of like street level kind of mob kind of thug stuff going on with people who I'd never seen before, and grabbing me and shoving me around. And so there is a lot of tension there. I get the sense of Jesse Jackson and the question of the dynamics of the apparent assassination of what looks like a real, obviously can be many different kinds of critical takes from many different perspectives in terms of King, his background, his political commitments, all of that kind of thing. But to me, it looks like at the very least, he was an American Black Christian radical who had a method, a very American and a very, philosophically nonviolent based approach to how to engender change inside of the American system, which to me would have been for the better. And then that was then disrupted, and then a toxic mimic of that, most obviously, I would say, in the form of an individual like a Jesse Jackson, was then inserted to where we are today, where he is now being put front and center as for the Palestinian solidarity movement as the best character to call for a ceasefire, which has become like the term to go to, which then also will not deal with the deep politics of October 7th, the Iraq War, the 9/11, the War on Terror as an Israeli gambit in many ways, right? Of course. So there's all of that going on. Then finally, I'd just like to finish up by pointing out this Charlie Kirk, RFK Jr. kind of horseshoe. It almost you could see a troika in many ways that apparently, I think, tries to keep under control aspects of the right, where you have Nick Fuentes, sort of like an E. Michael Jones, kind of next generation E. Michael Jones type in terms of quote unquote philosophy, as operationally and professionally as the next generation for sort of later millennials and Zoomers, as really just the Rush Limbaugh and then Alex Jones type for the live streaming age or something like that. That's one. Then you have this Charlie Kirk who's meant to represent, Con Inc. or the middle of the road Republican conservatives who are more and more embracing the culture wars and intensifying the culture wars. And then I would say you have this stopgap measure of the RFK Jr., who's suspected as being, too liberal, obviously, because he is, his background as an environmental lawyer. He's obviously a liberal of some sort, but he's also has, captured the moment in terms of COVID and the culture war surrounding COVID. And he represents almost like a middle of the road backstop under the guise of an independent candidate for president to a lot of this, narrative analysis, I think. And so RFK Jr. basically seizing the moment to justify, as you said, as you were pointing out, his father and the president's, surveillance of King and all that, without then calling into question the nature of Hoover directly. And it's obvious, like, that Robert Kennedy had tension with Hoover. There was suspicion there. But for putting aside Kennedy's relationship with Hoover, we now know that Hoover was directly compromised by the Meyer-Lansky, super mob, the Jewish mob in the United States that then became the undergirding network for the rise of the Jewish state, and work to get weapons there. And there's more and more evidence that via such power families inside of the Jewish power establishment, such as the Schein family, the Krinsky family, which became the Crown family, which took over General Dynamics. There's a whole piece of General Dynamics in terms of the assassination of John Kennedy and the Vietnam War that then hooks into Texas politics and the Johnson question in all of that, to the Schein family, who were basically the ones who owned the property where Hoover had his photo taken and then owned by Meyer Lansky, in terms of him being, closeted, having a closeted gay relationship with Tolson. And so this is right there in the background of the combination of the question of Israel-Palestine in the contemporary moment, but then directly tells us a lot of what we really need to know right now in terms of the questions of the assassinations of both of the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King Jr. And increasingly now we're getting more and more information about the assassination of Malcolm X, that I think would be a good year for us to delve into some of the forensics around that, and especially how they can help us understand how we're being meant to be contained within these kinds of narrative landscapes that I think, are very clearly framed on the right by Fuentes, Kirk, and RFK Jr., and then these similar kinds of networks with a different kind of approach on the left, which I would just point out this question of Jesse Jackson and Palestinian solidarity. And then maybe in the future we can get more into my assessment of Jewish Voice for Peace right now, and the apparent desire and apparent stand down of actually directly confronting Jewish power and the Israel lobby institutions, while deferring that to like shutting down freeways, confronting, protesting outside of Congress people's offices. Sure, that's good political lobbying. But if that doesn't go hand in hand with directly confronting the Israel lobby and the nature of its Jewish power dynamic, such as the Jewish Federation had a meeting in Kansas City that the elements of Jewish Voice for Peace knew about and even talked about. That would be a very we should figure out how to properly demonstrate or protest in relationship to that. And mum's the word on those kinds of things, while there's this replication of shutting down train stations and freeways, which just even politically doesn't seem to make sense. It just gets sort of the average person angry. I understand.
It makes people feel inconvenienced as opposed to going into these actual power centers. And I understand like human protest, the nature of like making these public displays as you're talking about, but it gains a lot of hostility and animus from people who are just trying to move along their lives, who are very inconvenienced by it, as opposed to like what you're talking about with like going directly to the power centers.
Exactly. And so, more and more you begin to see the aspects of certain parts of the Palestinian solidarity movement, all the way from the Jewish progressive radical groups to the more Muslim-based, Palestinian-based groups, that there is a lot of geopolitical question here in terms of the nature of what they're doing and what they're not doing, especially, I would say, in relationship to some of these Jewish groups. Because in a certain way, we are in a repetition of the post 9/11 era. We're in the post Israel's 9/11 era. And so similar kinds of things that we saw, where there was a big push against the Iraq war, including amongst, large portions of the Jewish American community, that was then led up in many cases by some of these Jewish progressives who purposefully stood down at some of these biggest, pre-Iraq war rallies, especially like in New York City. They stood down Palestinians, they stood down Arab and Muslim activists and intellectuals, and they definitely stood down questions of 9/11 truth, especially as it might go directly to the commanding heights of the Israeli so-called security state. And so things have been sort of opened up and softened a little bit. People who were directly on the side of the Israel lobby and the Iraq war back then, such as Peter Beinart, are now talking sort of anti-Israel apartheid, and they're against the Israeli response post 9/11. But the deep politics of all of this continue to be, I would say, the missing piece, and ultimately, I think, the Achilles heel of some of these very synthetically organized, at least at the narrative and sort of activist operational level, about, who are we going to protest? Who are we going to, quote unquote, inconvenience with our core political speech? Is it going to be everyday drivers and passengers from like the 110 freeway in Southern California to train travelers in New York City? Or is it going to be these Jewish federations with their events ongoing where we should be actually protesting outside and calling to question the nature of the Israel lobby and its power in the United States, and how really destructive it is, not only to obviously to the lives of both Palestinians ongoing, but also to Israelis over many years, I would say too, but also intensely to the American lives. Both in terms of the cost, the trillions of dollars of quote unquote lost investment, in terms of these wars, many of them very driven by the Israel lobby, or whether it's this seditious assault on core political principles, rights, and values in the United States, in terms of the backing by the Israel lobby of the 1/6 insurrectionists, to the ongoing rolling out of these anti-First Amendment, anti-BDS laws throughout the state governments.
All right, and I think with that, Jeremy, this is a good place to wrap up, and we'll have to pick up this conversation again very soon. But I'm glad to be back doing this with you again, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Me too. Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody out there. Thank you for rocking with us while we had a much needed break. And we will be back very consistently in this newish year. All right. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.